Alright, I gotta switch that.
Great, now the car's in position, let's go over the tools. And this is it. This is everything you need right here, surprisingly, on one table. So you're gonna need a socket set. If you don't have this, you're gonna need 110, a 12, a 14, and a 17. You're also gonna need a 22, but if you don't have one, you can use a 7/8. You're also gonna need some wrenches, including an adjustable one, so make sure you have one on hand. You're also gonna need some deep sockets from the sizes I mentioned before. And another thing you need is gonna be this swivel adapter. There's also extensions, but this is invaluable for this project, so make sure you have one. Next, you're gonna need a breaker bar, some pliers, a couple of extensions, a flathead, and a Phillips head screwdriver too. Also, you need something handy to pry the engine from the transmission, so a long screwdriver like this one, or get a pry bar. And that's all the tools you guys need, so let's get to it. I also wanted to give a shout out to Master Subaru technician Mike Barr and his friend Kerry Holzman. Mike was one of the many reasons why I started doing this and gave me the confidence. So if you're ever watching this, thank you. You're a total inspiration. The first step we're going to tackle is removing the radiator. You don't have to do this, but to avoid the engine hitting the radiator when you uninstall it, we're just going to knock it out just in case. But if you're a seasoned veteran of removing engines, you know better than that. To drain the radiator, the pitcock is actually in the bottom left of the radiator, which is on the passenger side of the vehicle. You twist it counterclockwise. Just be sure to remove the drain before you remove the cap on top because it's a very pressurized system, and once you remove that cap, all that fluid will drain out immediately. Alright, now the coolant's being drained, we're going to tackle the intake air box. And for this step, all you need is a 10mm and a flathead screwdriver. Now we're going to remove the battery before we go any farther in this project. You want to remove this because we're going to be touching the alternator and a lot of electrical parts, and metal and electricity do not mix. First step of removing a radiator is removing the bracket. And this is held in with a 12mm bolt. So this next part is specifically for the automatic transmission guys. There are two lines filled with transmission fluid that need to be removed. So make sure you have a pan below so you can catch the actual transmission fluid leaking from this. Yeah, because it will leak. I thought it was a coolant line, but I was completely wrong.
Oh shit.
Now we gotta remove the remaining hoses, which should be empty because we drained the coolant. But there might be some left over, so just be a little careful. Now you want to swing under your car to remove the actual connections for the fans. And since we're down there, might as well unhook the hose connected to the thermostat housing. Again, use a pan because this thing will leak even though the radiator is drained. And that's it for the radiator. And I should have been wearing safety glasses. Alright, removing the alternator is actually really easy. You need to remove two covers. The cover on the right is held in by two 10mm bolts. The cover on the left side is held in by one 10mm on the left side and then a 12mm on the pivot bolt on the alternator. So just loosen that one up slightly. Now that the covers are off, you can tackle the connections. You gotta use a 10mm bolt to remove the ground on the alternator, and there's just a tab on the connection. Now you want to carry that same 12 to remove the actual bracket that holds in the alternator. All you need to do is loosen the bottom bracket bolt and then the top one screws just fine. By doing this loosens up the entire bracket for you to remove the actual pivot bolt on the right side. Once you get everything unbolted, the whole thing should come right out. Unless you're me. For some reason mine was stuck. The power steering is held in by three 12mm bolts. There's one in the very far back and two right in the front. Personally, in my vehicle, there's only two bolts being held down because one of the bolts in the front's been stripped out. Now, to actually remove the power steering, you have two more 10mm bolts on the left side of the engine, and this is what keeps your hoses in place. Now that everything's removed, you can actually lift up and then put it on top of your left-hand strut tower. Just be careful not to break any hoses while you do this too. And since we're on this side of the engine anyways, might as well remove this one air hose, these two spark plug wires, and this ugly big thing. Now we're going to tackle the linkage. It's super easy to remove, but it's also super easy to mess it up, as in don't touch the rear bolt and only loosen up the front bolt. The rear bolt is what keeps it aligned, so you don't have to realign it when you put it back. So make sure you only loosen the front bolt. And with that being said, all you need to do is loosen the front bolt, pull it back, and then pull it out. They should come out no problem. And as you can see, you just have to shimmy the front and they pop right out. To remove the second drive belt, all you need is a 12mm. First, loosen up the pulley bolt, then loosen up the tensioning bolt. This should relieve the pressure on the belt itself so it can be easily removed. Then you remove the bracket. Luckily these are 12s too, so go ahead and just remove those. By the way, this is your idler pulley, so if yours is squeaking, might as well replace it now. It's time to remove the fuel line, so make sure you have some safety glasses and some gloves, or in my case a rag. These are held in by some Phillips head clips. So just go systematically one after another to make sure you do them correctly. Because honestly, these are also packed with fuel, so this can get everywhere if you're not careful. Make sure you have that rag really handy. Now we're going to tackle the biggest thing on top of this engine, which is going to be the actual intake. So we need to clean up a little bit, so we're going to remove the last two spark plug wires and unclip this connection from the AC compressor, which in return is actually connected to the wires from the alternator. Now that's out of the way, we can push it to the side. There are going to be a total of 8 bolts, 4 on each side, and you guessed it, they're all 12mm. Just make sure you have an extension handy. Now that we got the bolts removed, we need to remove the EGR valve. This is a flare nut and it needs a 14mm wrench. Alright, cool. Everything is unhooked except plugs and hoses, so we're going to knock all of them out right now. The very first one is going to be this inlet hose right here. It's actually in the way of a lot of these plugs, so we're going to immediately take it off. Now twist that hose out of the way and now remove the ignition coil wire. Second, we're going to take off the throttle position sensor. Now it's going to be the IAC, which is going to be the idle air control solenoid valve. This was actually really hidden. This is going to be the purge control solenoid valve. This one's pretty tough to take out, but just keep trying, you'll eventually get it. It's just in a really terrible angle. After you get the last one out, the next two are super easy. This is located in the front of your engine, this is the crankshaft position sensor, and the next one's going to be the oil pressure switch. Now we're going to go back to the same position where we were before, getting all those other plugs out, and then on the bottom near the transmission, there's going to be a row of plugs. These plugs need to come off, including the bracket. The two gray ones are self-explanatory and those pop off real easy, but the last one is actually really tough. The clip is actually in the very bottom, so to remove this, you need to remove the actual bracket, which is held in by a 12mm. Alright, so we finally knocked out the majority of the plugs, but not all of them. The rest are actually under the intake. Now, all we need to do is get a piece of wood and prop it up so we can reach the rest. Now that the intake is propped up, we can see one hose and 2 plugs on the coolant crossover pipe. If you don't have enough room to get under the intake, there's no problem adding more wood. Once you finally get the hose out of the way, next is the engine coolant temperature sensor. Right next to this is also the engine coolant temperature gauge. Now we're going to tackle the brake booster hose, which is probably the easiest to take off. Now that we're on this side of the intake, we got one more hose and one more connection. And this is going to be your knock sensor. Just a heads up, if there's a crack in it, it's definitely not knocking anymore. And that should have been everything. So, you should be able to knock it out no problem. No, there's there's one more. This one's the easiest plug, and I can't believe I forgot it. It's the camshaft position sensor. After this is unplugged, it should be ready to come out. By the way, if it's not coming out, it's probably because your EGR valve is stuck inside the intake. So just get a screwdriver or a flathead and pry it out. I'm personally going to be saving my gaskets because this is my second time ripping this thing out. Alright, now the intake's out of the way, that was the majority of the clutter, so you should have a nice open engine. Perfect time to take out the AC compressor. It's held in by 4 14mm bolts. Now you want to get it out of the way. You need to use 2 bungee cords to toss it to the side of the car. Just be really wary because these lines might be old and full of Freon, and when that busts, you're going to have a bad time. So just be extra careful with this. Now it's time to remove the coolant crossover pipe. It's held in by 4 10mm bolts and 1 Phillips head screw clamp. Now that the crossover is removed, we got 1 more hose to remove, and now we got to remove the oil filler pipe. And the filler pipe is held in by 2 10mm bolts. Alright, that's everything on top, guys. Good job. Now we gotta go back under the car, take off the exhaust, the motor mounts, and drain the oil if you haven't already. Make sure you have a clean pan and a 17mm socket. It's also really good etiquette to remove the oil filter too, especially if you're doing the head gaskets. Gotta remove all the oil as much as possible. So this is the perfect time to do it. And just to give a heads up, I've only had this oil for about 2,000 miles. Now we're going to tackle the exhaust manifolds. These guys take a deep 14mm socket. The reason why you're using a socket is because these are actually nuts and they're held in by studs. There's going to be a total of 6, 3 on each side. There might be a really good chance that this might happen to you. So basically the bolt didn't break and the stud came out instead. Don't worry, you can put it right back in when you're reinstalling it. Since we finally got the exhaust nuts, now we can use the exact same 14mm to remove the motor mount nuts. There's a total of 2, which means 1 on each side. As you can tell, I had a really terrible time removing this nut. So instead of going and finding a power tool, I used my legs. And this is not the first time you're going to see me do this in this whole project. Now that we've removed both nuts, we need to drop the exhaust manifold. The reason being, there's a good chance the studs might get stuck on the manifold and you can't lift the engine out. So what that means, I'm going to use these planks to put between the chassis and the exhaust manifold, and hopefully have enough clearance. And that's basically it. Now that we removed all the bolts, we're finishing the bottom. Now the next thing to tackle is the 4 bolts holding the engine to the transmission, and another 4 bolts holding the torque converter. First, we're going to tackle this ground, which sits on top of the starter. This bolt is located on the driver's side of the engine, and it's a 12mm. Now that the ground is out of the way, now we tackle the ground on the starter, which is also held down by a 12mm nut. Right beside this ground, once it's removed, is also a connection. This connection here, you pinch to remove. So make sure you don't pull on it or it might break. Now, we can finally get started on the starter. It's held in by 1 bolt and 1 nut. Before we knock out the starter, we have to remove this bracket that held in the air box. It's going to get in the way, so might as well remove it completely while we're at it. There are 2 12mm bolts holding this down. The top bolt of the starter is held in by a 14mm bolt. 1 out of 4 bolts is out now, as the one below is held in by a 17mm bolt. With this bolt, I had a very tough time. The space was very limited, so I had to use a 17mm wrench to remove the bolt, and a little foot power. And now thankfully, your starter is removed. Now that we removed the starter, we can actually start removing the torque converter bolts. To remove them and get to them, you need to turn the engine. To turn the engine, you need a 22mm socket, or in my case, a 7/8 socket. So this in return turns the harmonic balancer so you can see each individual bolt, which are 12mm. Normally, you would have to take off a cover to see these torque bolts, but mine's gone. Now on the passenger side of the engine, there were 3 plugs in a row. Next to that, there's a second bracket. This bracket is being held down by the second bell housing bolt. This is going to be a 14mm. Now right below this bolt, there's a nut holding down the engine. This is the only thing holding down the engine on the passenger side, which is going to be the 3rd out of the 4. Alright, and this last bolt was the hardest bolt for myself, and there's one clear reason why. So here's a PSA, make sure you jack the engine up just a little bit, because this bolt took me 2 days to take off because I didn't do this one step. And I took off countless things that did not need to be removed just so I can have more room to remove this bolt. So save yourself some time, buy a swivel socket or a swivel extension, and get under the car to remove this last bolt. Once you remove this last bolt, you should be able to see the transmission and engine separate. This is perfect. This indicates that you've done everything right so far. Now the very last thing impeding you is this torque mount. This impedes you from lifting the transmission higher so you can remove the engine. So for this you need two 14mm, one to hold the bolt and one to hold the nut. And make sure you stick them together so you don't lose them. Now grab one of those 14s to loosen up the top bolt. This, in return, allows you to lift up the torque mount, but you don't have to remove it, unless it's broken. Then just replace it and toss it in the trash. But if it's not, lift it up and tighten it back down. Alright guys, good job! The engine's free and it's ready to come out. There are many ways you can remove this engine from the engine bay right now. Me personally, I'm using chains. So as you can tell, there's no mounting points on this engine anymore. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the two bolts holding down the intake on each side. So make sure to know the weight limit of any item you're using to pull this engine. My weight limit for these chains is 1,800 pounds, which is way more than enough to make sure this thing does not break under the weight. So whatever you're using, make sure you use really good washers to hold down these bolts and make sure they don't slip from either the chains or the straps you're going to use. Personally, I got a 3-foot chain. I still had an excessive amount on both sides, but I also had a lot to play with, so it's better to get more than less so you don't have to go back to the store to get a bigger chain. And I also got a second chain, and this chain length is 2 feet, which is to be connected to one of the AC bolts in the front, so I can have an easier time pulling the engine out and making sure everything's level. And the bolt I used for the front chain was the bolt from the torque mount. Now that you have everything situated and secured, now you can bring the crane in. And the crane I'm using for this project is the 1-ton crane from Harbor Freight. So, just to let you know, it definitely can be done with a 1-ton crane. Though a 2-ton crane would have made this project a little easier. So make sure you secure all the chains on the hook. Alright, great. You got tension on the chain and everything situated. Now, do you remember the two bolts you removed from the bottom of the transmission housing in the engine? Those two bolts were holding two studs holding the engine to the transmission. With that being said, that means now you need to pry the engine from the transmission housing. And to do that, you need to get some flathead screwdrivers or a pry bar. If it's still causing you a lot of trouble and you can't separate the engine and the transmission, it might be because of the exhaust manifold in the very bottom of the engine is getting stuck on the studs that you removed earlier. Another cause could be basically you don't have it high enough, but you really got to be wary and make sure you don't lift it too high so your transmission hits your chassis. But believe me, you'll be shaking this engine back and forth, up and down until it becomes loose. So don't sweat if you can't take it out the first time or even the third time. Just keep trying, you'll definitely get at it. Just be careful of the chains and make sure they don't slip off. Personally, to me, this is probably the dangerous step, but as long as you have confidence in yourself, you should prevail. And there you go, the engine is out and it's about. Now you can change your clutch, you can clean your engine bay, or, like I'm gonna do, change your head gaskets. So here's another friendly PSA. I bought some washers for this specific task, and as you can see, they were too small and they slipped through the links. This is super dangerous, as in you can drop your engine, and for some reason I have a tendency of putting my leg out when something drops in front of me, and there would have been my leg gone. So I used the washers that were for the motor mounts, and I slipped them right in and they fit just fine. So heads up, if you don't have any washers, use those instead. And if you're gonna put your engine down, make sure you have a good space, because you do not want to put a lot of weight on the oil pan. And as you can see here, I kind of balanced the engine out with the motor mounts, and so there was no weight applied on the actual aluminum oil pan. And I was able to replace those slipping bolts with those good washers, and there was no weight applied to it. Now that the engine is out, it's a perfect time to tackle the flex plate. It's held in by 8 14mm bolts. The problem though is I wouldn't use hand tools, and I would use a power tool for this. It's on there pretty well and the bolts are pretty shallow, so I'm pretty sure you're going to strip the bolt before you remove it with any hand tools. One of the many reasons why you want to remove this flex plate is because when it came factory, it had plastic seals behind this, and they usually leak when they get over 100,000 miles. So the replacements now are aluminum. So again, since you already have it out, replace it. Now that we've got everything situated, now we're going to put on an engine stand. And the stand I'm using is the Harbor Freight one that has a 1,000-pound capacity. To prep this step, you need a couple bolts and a lot of washers. The bolt you're going to snag up is going to be a 10mm by 1.25 pitch. The amount of washers and bolts you need depends on the kind of engine stand you're using. For instance, I only need 2 bolts for this engine stand because the studs on the engine only use nuts. And to be honest, one of the bolts on the right side of the engine was long enough for me to use, so I only ended up using one of the bolts out of the two. But it's totally better to be safe than sorry. If you're going to be using any engine stands, make sure you grease up the shaft before you toss it in. The grease I used was white lithium grease. But this doesn't stop you from using anything else though. This is what I personally had on hand. When you're ready to move the engine to the engine stand, be sure to connect everything while it's still on the engine hoist. Now that you have everything situated, you can connect the engine to the engine hoist. So I made sure the engine was a little lower than the slot for the engine hoist. Then I kind of swung it into position. Now that the engine is slotted, that's pretty much it. Unless you didn't grease it up and they're gonna have a terrible time. So after reviewing the footage, it's better to have two people than one, but it's definitely possible for one person. And that's everything, guys. From start to finish, this is how you take out a 2.5 dual head overcam. The next step in my series, I'm going to be changing the head gaskets in detail. So, like and subscribe and comment down below if you have any questions, and I'll see you guys in the next one.